a topic very sensitive, very delicate, and I'm going to ask you that you would pray not just for me, but for us, that God would speak truth to us and that we would be ready to receive it. Our Father in heaven, we approach this text as we do every other, with humility and hunger. Lord, you need to communicate this. You need to speak this. You need to say things regarding this that we desperately need to hear. You need to get beyond the limitations of this preacher, beyond the limitations of our biases and our prejudices, and speak light and truth into our hearts. Father, help us to receive today your word, not for our purposes, but for yours. Help us to see that what you are saying today is so much more about you than it is about anyone else. Father, today your word, in great power, but in great grace, with great authority, but with great tenderness, touches some sore spots in people's lives. But as we have trusted you with our souls and our eternity, surely we can trust you with our deepest wounds. And I pray that you would give us ears to hear, hearts to receive what you have to say today. And we will let your word have the final word. In Jesus' name, amen. You can take your seats. This that we cover today is exactly why we handle the text, the scriptures, entire books of the Bible or large passages the way we do, that we go verse by verse in a kind of an expository walk through what it is God has to say. See, when we handle a passage like this, it doesn't allow the preacher's cowardice to make us hopscotch over the tough stuff. It doesn't make our desire to have everyone happy and everyone be comfortable win out over our desire to see everyone know Jesus and serve him well. And I know right about now some people are saying, I picked the wrong Sunday to be here. I would have liked to have missed this Sunday, and I respectfully put to you that would be wrong. God's got no problem saying what he says. I don't feel a sense of blushing in Jesus' voice as he says this stuff. I can't even imagine him stammering when he speaks these truths. So we would diminish it if we handled it with fear and trembling. Again, if we trust him and we trust that his truth is truth, then I'm going to invite you to throw your heart wide open and let God say those things that need to be said. And like I said, there's very few topics that hit so close to home as this. Very few topics, I think, that cause as many varied reactions in people. Today, I think we all know someone whose life has been touched by divorce. I think every single one of us. Many here have felt the searing pain of divorce personally. You've felt it. You've experienced it yourself. I don't need to tell you that it's painful. I don't need to tell you that it causes confusion. I don't need to tell you that it makes you question everything, including your faith at moments. Perhaps you watched your parents divorce as a child, and you still bear the marks, and you still maybe emotionally walk with a little bit of a limp because of what it's done and how it's marked you in deep and abiding ways, and it's made you unsure. If those people that I was counting on to be the one solid relationship in my life that wasn't going to go anywhere suddenly goes away, it does something to your ability to trust. And perhaps you're the parent of grown children, and you've watched your children go through a divorce. And you've probably wished I could take the pain and feel it myself rather than watch them go through it. And then to add to it, to see grandchildren shuffled and moved about, bartered with, used as bargaining chips, and the pain that goes with that. And I don't need to tell you that it hurts and that it costs dearly and that it causes deep turmoil. And as we approach this today, I have no intention of causing any further distress. God has no intention of opening up old wounds. But so long as we cope with whatever pain we've gone through, so long as we cope with that based on anything outside of God's truth, we are medicating ourselves with something that comes up short, and we know in our heart of hearts it does not satisfy. It does not bring peace. It postpones real healing, and it just gets us by from day to day to day. But there's something in our heart, someone in our heart, the Holy Spirit saying, there is a greater truth. There is a more complete healing. There is a place in me where you can bring all of that. Bring it dragging, bring it limping, but bring it. Because you already tried to hang Christianity on it and it still hurts. And you try to just memorize a couple verses that'll maybe help the sting go away, but it just seems like there's some unsettled issues there. And maybe even there's a fear, maybe I don't want to know the truth. Maybe I don't want to know exactly what God says, because it might turn out that I'm wrong. It might even turn out that I'm the problem. At the end of it all, it might turn out that I sinned. Let me give you a few key truths right up front that I hope will help you listen to the rest of the message. See, here's the danger. When we start talking about something like this, as soon as I said divorce, some of your hearts went on high alert. And you put up your dukes, and you pulled out all your what ifs and all your yeah buts. And it makes it hard to hear everything that comes after that. So let me say a few things that I pray through the Holy Spirit. He would open your heart just enough and just give you a little bit of peace and talk you off the ledge for a moment, just so you can hear what God has to say. First of all, this message is for everyone, no matter where you are at the moment. Because as so many people that are here today that have gone through divorce could tell you, there was a time where they felt maybe like you feel, like, I don't need this message, this is a throwaway. But it comes, the storm comes. So this is for every last one of us. If you're single, you need this. Oh, you need this. If you're married and there hasn't been talk of divorce and everything seems fine, you need this to keep it that way. And there's no room in this. There's no room in what Jesus has to say here today that allows us to feel so unique in our situation. I understand. I think it'd be the cruelest thing in the world to stand up with some standardized cookie-cutter way of handling divorce and just say, hey, this is what it is, it's easy. I got 3 points that'll handle divorce. Now, every single circumstance involves precious people and details. But don't ever let the uniqueness of your situation, the uniqueness of your details preclude you from receiving what God has. Don't think that you're so unique that neither the scripture nor the preacher nor anything that has to be said here could reach me, could heal me, could help me, or even maybe convict me to the point of turning towards God. No one is that unique to be out of the reach of God's hand. Now, I'll tell you something else that there's no room for here. There's no room for boasting. There's no room for bragging. Before you sit there and cross your arms and self-righteously nod your head and say amen for them, that your marriage is so together and you've had it together for years, maybe decades. Let me tell you something. Just staying together doesn't make a marriage either. There's no room for boasting. And if you've managed to keep it together, and if you manage even to have a marriage that is giving God the glory, that is all due to His grace and mercy. Because one day in every one of our marriages, two sinners stood up at an altar and said, I do. And if it works, it's because God's in the middle of it, and He's doing what we can't. So there's no room for boasting if you've got it together. There's no room for self-righteousness that says, well, yes, maybe I'm divorced, but it happened despite my holiness. It happened despite me being perfect and them being completely wrong. There has never been, ever been a divorce that didn't have at its root sin. Ever. And few, if ever, few marriages have been broken up purely by the sin of one person. Now, there's also no room here for self-condemnation for those who have trusted in Jesus. I need to say this up front or you're not going to be able to hear the rest of the message. Divorce, as with any other decision or act committed before coming to Christ, divorce, adultery, anything that you may have committed to contribute to household pain before you came to Christ, it all comes under the blood of Jesus. If any man is in Christ Jesus, any man, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. Know that. You don't have a right to crucify yourself over that which He died for already. So there's no room for self-condemnation. I'll tell you what else there's no room for. There's no room for discrimination or stigma. There's a place, not a lower place, not a back of the line place. There's a place, a loving place in the church of Jesus Christ for people who've been touched by divorce. It's where you belong. We don't make concessions or exceptions to let you in. It's where you belong as much as any one of us. There needs to be no apologies for you walking in without a mate. There needs to be no awkwardness, no feeling of being that third wheel. We like tricycles here. And when you walk in, we don't look and say, hey, where's their mate? We say, praise God, there's a soul as precious as mine. And while divorce never, ever glorifies God in His original design, hear me. Divorce, whether before you were saved or even in those dark, misguided moments after you were saved, for causes that Christ was big enough to handle, even if the divorce happened afterward, I will say this unequivocally. Divorce is not the unpardonable sin. Come to Jesus. Now, a caution. I feel like I'm going to spend more time setting this up than actually preaching it, but I'm hoping you can hear me. A caution here. Our approach to this passage, as with any other passage, is crucial. How we come to it, what expectations we come from, and what our goal is in coming to it matters. Did you come to read into it or read out of it? Did you come to receive from it, or to impress your way of seeing things and your situation upon it, I put it to you today, let the Word read you and come out with truth. Back in the early 20s, a comedian, some of you may be familiar with W.C. Fields, was a notorious, drunk, blaspheming, womanizing, just a sinner of all kinds, and unabashedly so. He was filming a movie one time and was sitting in his hotel room when one of his managers walked in unannounced, opened the door to find W.C. Fields sitting on his bed reading a Gideon Bible that someone had left there. And the person was startled. This is W.C. Fields. His room reeked of rum, and all he could think to say is, "What are you doing?" And in W.C. Fields' classic quick wit, he says, "I'm looking for loopholes. I'm reading this Bible to see if there's a way that I can accommodate my sin. I'm reading this Bible to see if I can find some kind of a technicality upon which I can base my continued sin." And I think we've all, particularly in areas where it hurts, we've all come to the Bible that way at times. But I pray that today we can ask God for His truth. That we don't come looking for loopholes. That we don't even come primarily looking for a lesson on divorce. But that we would come and say, we would see Jesus. I want to know something about you that will have an effect, yes, on my marriage. It will have an effect on maybe the wounds of divorce. I want to know something about you. I'm more interested in you today than what you can do for me. That's where the healing really, really begins. We can't come to this passage or any other one just to find permission or justification for something that we've done or maybe are considering. Let's hear what Jesus has to say. He's making a point that will apply to your situation, but his point is not just about your situation, it's about Him. God, God's Word, creation, everything He does is to make Himself known to us. It is a man-centered gospel. It is the height of humanism to take our Bibles and say, yeah, I believe that there's a God, but I believe that everything He's written, everything He does, the reason He exists is for me. So I'm going to invite us away from that selfishness, because isn't that what happens sometimes when we get hurt? All we can think about is our hurt. I mean, don't you do it? I do it. I get a headache and the whole family suffers. Don't you guys get it? I have a headache. You want to eat? You want to what? You want to turn on the, why are you all not, what? Do you not know that the universe revolves around me, particularly when I'm in pain? It's all I can think about. How can you think of anything else? If it's all I can focus on, and sometimes in our pain, our emotional pain, our heart pain, we get the same way. I want to invite you away from that. That if you leave here, if you walked in divorce, you're going to walk out divorced. But with a vision of Jesus, of Him being so sufficient in your life, of a healer, of a companion, of a reconciler, that you'll be more satisfied than if I came up here with 5 points, the 6 keys, the 9 steps, all the magic that nobody can work. But I know a Savior who saves and heals. And so let me say this today. This is not going to be the definitive, exhaustive work on divorce. I was telling Ramon the other day, I've probably read in the last 10 or 12 days, maybe 120, 130 pages from various writers and scholars and theologians on this topic. And you get probably just about as many opinions on some of these verses. And there's so much to say, and the hard part about preaching a message like this in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, This wasn't the Sermon on Divorce. It was the Sermon on the Mount. He's saying some larger thing. He's going some particular place with this. And he speaks in 2 verses about divorce. And so it's hard to say I'm going to teach you everything about divorce. We're not going to cover everything about divorce. We will later. Maybe just take some time, 2, 3, 4 weeks. I mean, it deserves that attention. But we won't be talking about all the what abouts, all the questions that you might have. What about physical abuse? What about addiction? What about if they're gambling away all our finances? What if they're emotionally cruel? These are all realities. We won't be able to cover all of that today, but then why do you even bring it up, Pastor? I'm bringing it up to say the Bible does speak to these things, and if you have an ongoing issue and you want answers, there is prayer, there is the scripture, and there is the elders. We would love to sit with you. If you have a question, we would love to explain these things to you. There are answers. Now, we won't be covering even all that Jesus had to say about divorce. We're going to cover just 2 passages. We're not going to cover what Paul had to say about divorce, 1 Corinthians 7 and the like. Probably wondering, what are we going to cover, Pastor? But we are going to cover what Jesus had to say in 2 portions just in Matthew. We're going to talk about the 2 verses we just read within the Sermon on the Mount, and then we're going to look at Matthew chapter 19 in the context of the Sermon on the Mount and his further extrapolation on that. But we're going to look at it again with respect to Christ revealing his relationship to the law. You remember that he said, life in my kingdom is going to be made up of a people whose righteousness surpasses the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then he goes about laying a pattern that we saw beginning a couple of weeks ago. We saw it last week and we see it again today, where Jesus begins to speak to them in contrasts, and he sets up these contrasts. He says, you have heard it said, but I say. And it's not that he's pitting himself against the law. It's kind of a double indictment. He's saying, first of all, you're saying things that aren't law. And number 2, you're missing the lawgiver standing right in front of you. And we saw it when he talked about murder. You said you should not murder. But I say to you, if you have anger in your heart towards someone, you've already murdered them in your heart. He goes right past the physical outworking down to the root of it, the sin that happens in the heart. And he did the same thing with adultery. He says, you pat yourselves on the back. You're so proud of yourselves. And you quote the scriptures and say you should not commit adultery. And you've managed to not commit physical adultery. But if you even look at a woman longingly that way, if you look at her with lustful intent, you have committed adultery in your heart. Don't praise yourself because you have clean hands. Your hearts are filthy. You're like whitewashed tombs, he always contended with them. He says, the law is deeper, and you've missed it. And the way that you have managed to even keep the outward requirements of the law have been cheap and dirty. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're not committing adultery. And you've managed to do that by setting up a legal system that allows you to change wives like socks. So that if you want a new wife, hey, no adultery here. I'll just drop this one and go to that one. Happened outside of the context of marriage, you think? And so you don't call it adultery. He says you're wrong. And as a matter of fact, today's text is a further thought on what we talked about last week, adultery. He's talking about marriage. He's continuing in that same vein, but he does draw another contrast. Another, you've said, you teach, you think, but I say. And he lays out a truth that I'm sure went down completely sideways. And as you'll see when we get to Matthew chapter 19, it totally went down sideways. And Jesus, continuing in the same message, speaking on a hillside to his disciples, says to them what we read in verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He says this is the teaching of the day. He says this was said. Now he's not saying this was said by God. He's not saying even that this was said by Moses. It's being said by you. You're the ones that are teaching this. This is what you've heard. This is what the teaching of the day is. This is how you govern this situation of marriage and divorce. And after his piercing revelation of adulterous hearts last week, he begins to deal with their mishandling of the scriptures. And it's so timely that what they were dealing with, what their society had degenerated into, is so much like what we have going here today. Today, that small percentage of people who even bother to get married anymore go into marriage with a plan B, at hand, and, mom's attorney on speed dial. Because things get crazy, I'm out. I've got my finger on the eject button, no problem. It's not an issue. And society as a whole is suffering for it. All the while, having children. The Society of Jesus Day 2 had developed this easy system of on-demand, no-fault divorce. You didn't have to prove fault. You didn't have to prove adultery. You didn't have to say this person did wrong. It just, all it took was one party. Just took one side to say, I'm done. And it was over. Just like ours. And when Jesus quotes what they were saying, he says, it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give a certificate of divorce. And Jesus quotes that very specifically because that was the entirety of their teaching. And it's an interesting thing because what they did to arrive at that teaching was they took one part of something that Moses says in Deuteronomy 24. They ripped out of context a few words out of a larger statement and then took those words and rearranged them. And then made a law out of it concerning how marriage is to be handled. Religion has a funny way of doing that. I had somebody not too long ago just disappointed in me that I could not take him to the chapter and the verse in the Bible that says the well-known proverb that God helps those who help themselves. What do you mean you don't know where that's at? I said, dude, not only is that not in the Bible, that's satanic. God doesn't help those who help themselves. God helps those who cannot help themselves at all. God helps those who humble themselves and come to the point of not knowing it. But he was so sure. Why? Because I'd always been told that. And he says, I hadn't even been told in church. And it's funny, if it's old enough and repeated enough, it must be true, huh? But of course it's not. And so Jesus quotes how they used to teach the topic. Now let's go back to the origin of it. Deuteronomy 24, I want to read to you the first 4 verses because it's important. It's very important to this. Because Jesus is again laying out, not a sermon on divorce, but he's laying out what his relationship is to the law. The law that they claimed they were keeping, that the scribes and the Pharisees said that they were championing in the world. He says, no, I'm going to say something far different to what the teaching of the day is. Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. Now this is Moses giving these civil ordinances to the people. And we're going to explain these here in a second. And it reads, Deuteronomy 24, verses 1-4. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if she then finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and he puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who takes her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Now we cannot misquote or misconstrue Moses' intention here. And Jesus exposes how those religious leaders of the day were teaching these tiny misquoted portions of what was the ordinances that were given to them, the civil laws that were given to them. And the emphasis on this provision here, that Jesus, we're not going to be done with this here. Jesus talks about this again in Matthew 19. You're going to have to stay with me today. But he says here, this is what happens under these circumstances. Now, the emphasis of this portion is not divorce. Oh, that's that divorce portion. No, it's not. That's not the thrust of what he's saying. That's not what he's talking about. It'd be tantamount to me saying, oh, you know, I'm going to go to church today. I'm going to put on my microphone and I'm going to sing some songs, preach a message, meet with the people, and go and have a nice lunch with my family and see some folks this evening. And you going home and saying, Pastor said you should wear a mic. That's doing violence to something that someone said. And the thrust of what he's saying here is not, this is how you can have a divorce and get by without any legal ramifications. The emphasis of it is something else entirely. And the emphasis of this is not, hey, and if you're going to get divorced, have all your paperwork in order. That's not what he's saying either. Let me read it to you again. I want you to note something. From verse 1 all the way to the first half of verse 4 is one sentence. It's one sentence leading to one thing. Listen. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and as she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then, here's the point, her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. That's what he's saying. The point of the ordinance is this. If you're going to be divorcing each other and sending your wife out and treating her badly, and let's say some guy takes in a wife and he says, I don't want you anymore, and you kick her out and you give her a certificate of divorce, and she goes to the next guy and says, hey, I'm divorced, and he says, hey, I'll marry you, and then he marries her, and he decides he doesn't like her, or he dies, and then she goes back out. She cannot go back to her first husband. That's the point. She cannot go back to her first husband. Why? Because now he's taking a woman who's been with another man, who he had once been in a covenant with. And God says, this is nasty and I don't want it in the land. That's the point. Now we can debate what God meant by that all day long. But notice that the point is not, if you're going to divorce a wife, paperwork makes it fine. That's not what he's saying. But that's what the Pharisees had done. He took it and said, well, we'll just have it mean this. It gets us by. Jesus exposes how they were doing violence to this. But see the grace and the mercy of God in what Moses is saying. He's telling the men, hey, you guys who are just dropping wives and changing partners like nothing, willy-nilly. He says, we're going to, clearly, God does not have to say again that he is against them divorcing their wives like this. It's been stated. How many times does God have to say something for it to be true? But he says, if you're going to go about this kind of a degenerate society treating women like this, he says, I'm going to build into your civil laws some ordinances that will help protect these women and their children if you're going to treat them that way. Now, you'll notice that and we're going to talk about this a little more when we get to Matthew 19, but you'll notice how when Jesus as Moses is laying out what God had put in his heart to govern the people with, There's going to be this assumption, and you're going to see it again in the next portion. There's this assumption of the woman getting remarried. And there's a reason for that, particularly in these days. Because a woman who didn't get remarried had one other option for survival, and that was prostitution. That was how she made it. That was the only way to make it, particularly if she had kids. So there's this assumption that she's going to go out and she's going to get married. Remember that when we get to Matthew 19. There's this assumption that you see keep coming up. I mean, you look at this hypothetical situation is if a woman gets married, he hates her, kicks her out, gives her a writ of divorce, she goes, finds another guy, and then he hates her. This is a lady with some pretty bad luck. But why does he lay it out like that? He goes, I want to show her getting remarried. Why? Because that's what has to happen now. This woman has to go and find some way to be cared for. Verse 32, back in Matthew 5:32. So we went to 24 to talk about this is what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were deriving their teaching from, but they had done it violence to do that. So Jesus says, you have heard it said wrongly that if you're going to divorce a woman, you just give her this piece of paper and it's all good. It was said, whoever divorces a wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now you tell me this, after the reading that we just did of Deuteronomy 24, does that sound anything like what Moses was talking about? They sum that up to say, this is what Moses was saying. If you're going to divorce a girl, give her a piece of paper. It's not at all what he was saying. Jesus clears it up, verse 32. But I say to you, I love the authority there. I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, in contrast to the religious leaders basing their divorce crazy teaching on the misuse of the civil ordinance, Jesus, the author of life and marriage, lays out some reality. First, let's look at what he includes, and then we're going to talk about what he excludes, okay? We're going to talk about what he says, and you saw it there, that there's an exception clause. You saw that? Let me read it one more time. I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So let's handle it minus the exception first, and then we'll add the exception to it. Let's just read it without that exception clause. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. We'll get back to the exception here in a second. Included here, everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. Notice again that the remarriage is assumed. Everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. What's he talking about? That if this guy divorces his wife on grounds that are less than legitimate, meaning that exception clause, if he divorces a wife for any other reason, and she has to go out and get married, her divorce is invalid. And she is, in God's eyes, a married woman getting married. And where does God put the onus for that? Where does he put responsibility? On the man. You kicked her out. She got married because she had to. It was marry or die. He puts it on the man. Now the circumstances are a little different. Today a woman could make it on her own. But you see, number one, again, we're not looking for our little exclusions. Do you see something about God here? Do you see the fairness? Do you see the justice of God? That he takes the responsibility for this woman not rightly divorced, marrying somebody else. He says, that's wrong, that's adultery, and it's your fault. Because you shouldn't have kicked her out like that. Included here, again, remember, everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. Jesus puts it on the husband. Everyone who divorces his wife, and it says at the end, and marries a divorced woman, commits adultery. Furthermore, anyone who marries the spouse of an invalid divorce would be marrying the spouse of another. And he calls this what it is. It's adultery. So what he's saying is there's divorce. Just because you say you're divorced and just because a piece of paper says you're divorced, he says if it's not a valid divorce, it's not valid. And God says Why else would he call it adultery? Adultery is when married people engage in sex with someone who's not their spouse. That's why he calls it adultery. Because that person is still married in his eyes. Now, let me take a big step back. Everybody exhale. Remember, you're saying, but what about me? Blood of Jesus washes sin, but it does not let us off the hook for knowing and from here on acting in truth. He goes on. There is an exception. Except on the ground of sexual immorality. So let's read it all in its entirety again. But I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. He says, essentially, all other divorces are not valid in God's eyes, except that there be on the part of one of those spouses an act of sexual immorality. Now, if you've ever studied this at all, you know that this is where a lot of other people have studied it as well, and a lot of thoughts come out. I am amazed at some of them, how folks get to where they get, but nonetheless, it's all based on how one particular word is handled. And it's where he says, except for on the ground of sexual immorality, that's one word in the Greek, and it's the word porneia. It's where we get the word pornography from. And it speaks of sexual immorality. In some versions, older versions of the Bible, it was translated fornication. Now, first of all, I want you to note, before we get into the technicalities of it, notice the narrow view that God takes here. Let's notice what is not in the exception clause. He doesn't say anything about falling out of love. He doesn't say anything about I grew tired of them. Doesn't say anything about we were growing in different directions. Doesn't say anything about simple, irreconcilable differences. Now, I know you're saying, yeah, but he's saying one thing. Except for sexual immorality. Again, that word porneia. Now, it is a broad term. And if you see that same word translated other places in Scripture, it's translated in a variety of ways that include adultery. It's broad enough that it includes adultery. Folks say, well, if Jesus said porneia there and not the more common word for adultery, then he's talking simply about fornication that happened in the betrothal period before they got married. Therefore, he's saying you can never, ever, under any circumstances, ever divorce. Ever. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. There's a whole lot of problems with that. Suffice it to say, it's an exception clause because it's an exception clause. Jesus makes an exception. And it's an exception that says something about him. It's an exception that says something about the glory of God. It's an exception that says something about the one flesh union that he speaks of when a man and a woman come together as husband and wife. That conjugal intimacy that is theirs alone, when that gets violated and treated cheaply and spread about, as the proverb writer says, when you spread your streams in the streets and you go about just with anyone, he says, no, it violates that. It's wrong to the point of damaging severely, not irreconcilably, not irreparably, but damaging the marital union to where there is an exception here. Again, this is saying more about God than it is about you being disrespected by him being with someone else. Granted, it's disrespectful. Granted, it's harsh. Granted, it treats someone else like garbage. But it says something far worse about a more holy God than you. And here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. This needs to be seen rightly, because I've had people march into my office and they've been almost happy. I can divorce now. Just found out he's sleeping with someone. He makes me so sick, I'm getting rid of him. Okay, so you're getting rid of him because he makes you sick. You don't have grounds. But he disrespected me. Disrespect is not grounds for that. You need to understand what happened when he slept with someone else. He defied God's holiness, not just your reputation. Because your marriage says more about God than it does about you. Your marriage is not to be lived out for you and your happiness, primarily. If at all, it's a very distant second. It's to the glory of God and to reflect His faithfulness to His covenant relationship. So, there remains an exception: adultery. Now, it's also important to note here, Jesus is not commanding divorce. See, I'm getting divorced. He said I could. He also said that my grace is sufficient. He also said to the seas and the winds, peace, be still. He also said to Lazarus, come forth. He said a lot of things you need to take into account. Nothing's too hard for God. Well, he said I could divorce. Yeah, he also said he is the Prince of Peace. Have you tried that one before him in prayer? Again, are we looking for loopholes or are we looking for Jesus? Yeah, but I have a right. Yeah, but he has power and might. And you have an opportunity to show the world that Jesus Christ is better and bigger than this. It's not that simple. We oversimplify it when we make it all about us. So, within just a few pages, this must be important to Jesus because we see him preaching it again, and this time at length. Matthew chapter 19. Starting at verse 1. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? So the Pharisees come to Jesus at this point. Between Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, he's healed a lot of people and preached a lot of word and just completely undone the authority of the Pharisees and the scribes in the eyes of the people. They're hearing someone speak with authority. By the time you get to the end of chapter 7, it says the people were in awe because he spoke as one having authority and not like the scribes and Pharisees. So he had done just irreparable damage to their sway. So now they're looking to trap him. They're trying to take his credibility away. So they try and set a trap for him, and they try and set it in this area. This was quite the topic in those days. If you read the writings of Flavius Josephus, he talks about that in these days there was two camps, and they were going at it over this one topic of divorce. And he says that they came and they tested him, and the question was, is it lawful, so it's a legal question, to divorce one's wife for any cause? And they're deliberately asking the question, any cause at all, because that was the burning question of the day. The whole Jewish world was basically divided up into two camps. One camp following the more conservative teaching of a rabbi by the name of Shammai, and his teaching was that you could only divorce your wife if you found some kind of indecency in her. And that indecency was broader than what the Word of God said, but nonetheless, that was how the more conservative camp saw things. The larger camp followed the wildly popular teaching of one man named Hillel, who taught you could divorce your wife for any reason at all, and it is even itemized. He gives examples, in fact, suggestions. You could divorce your wife, he says, if she's not aging well. You could divorce your wife if she cooks a meal poorly or breaks something in your house that you find of value, or if you merely tire of her. You can imagine that was quite the camp. And to be able to quote a rabbi, it just made him feel all the more justified to go about this. And so when they come to Jesus, they say, pick a camp, pick a team, because either way you lose. When you start making the gospel political, you lose. Pick a team here, so that way somebody's going to hate you, because right now a lot of people are believing you. And Jesus obviously doesn't bite at the bait. Jesus answers in verse 4. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, you didn't want to try and get into some kind of a dialectic debate, argument with the word in shoe leather. This is Jesus. And they said, simple question. Do you believe that we could drop our wives for any reason at all? Because no matter what answer you give that we can imagine, you're going to lose here. And Jesus turns to them and he speaks in stinging words. It kind of loses something in translation, but when he says to them, have you not read? He's speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees. Their whole life was predicated on the fact that they had read and reread and reread and reread and memorized and taught from the Word of God. And he asks them, have you even read the book? Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? He says, you base all of your authority and you take all this great pride in that when you teach, you reach all the way back to Deuteronomy and you quote the great Moses. He says, no, let's go back even further. Let's go back to the 6th day of creation, when God made man and woman and marriage, and the intention was one man, one woman for one lifetime, meaning until one of them died. They were to stay together, one flesh. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother? Now we use this scripture a lot to try and get that lazy kid out of the house who brings his wife home and starts having kids in the parents' house. I'm not, save your hate mail. We use this verse a lot now to tell people, hey, listen, dude, come on. Dude, it says right there, leave your father and mother, cut the umbilical cord, pay your own bills. And it works for that. I'm glad we have it. But when he's saying it to these Jewish people, he's saying something profound. Because the relationship to your father and mother in that culture is strong. Strong. You will honor your father and your mother. It's the first commandment with a promise. It means something profound, and it should. And he says, as profound as it is, it's to be trumped by your devotion to your wife. Leave them for her. We don't talk about divorcing our parents. Well, now we do talk about divorcing our parents. So we have legal proceedings for that garbage too. But he says, as valuable as that is, this relationship to a wife just supersedes it. I mean, he's speaking loud and clear. He'll leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. He just totally rewrites the math. You can't talk about separating one from two. You've only got one. You've only got one. When a couple is married, it's one. You're not test driving it. You're not checking it out. You're not reserving your rights. And let me say something here. I've already got problems. Don't make provision for two-ness. Those of you who have separate bank accounts and this is in his name and this have oneness in everything. Be vulnerable to one another. You could ruin me if you want to. You could take it and spend it all. You could drag my name through the streets, but I gave you my name. That's not even on the notes. That's bonus. And then he says, in no uncertain terms, lest there be a temptation to try and interpret it. He says, let me just bottom line it for you. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. This was his initial intent. This is God's ideal. This is what he meant. You want to talk about marriage? You have to talk about this, Pharisees. Don't come to me with technicalities on divorce if you don't understand the intent of marriage. It's really more of an exposition on who God is, how that's reflected in marriage, and because of sinners, sometimes it goes wrong, but that's tertiary. It's all about him. Don't try and make it all about this. And you know, humble hearts that were really looking for truth, with that last line would have said, done. Oh, dude, I mean, doesn't that kind of like conclusively end the argument? Well, God has brought together, let no man separate. They should have, like Job said, put their hand over their mouth and speak no more. These guys were not known for being so intelligent or so hungry for truth. And verse 7 opens with, and they said to him, they shouldn't have said anything to him. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Now here's your second mistake. Don't have a scriptural debate with Jesus. Why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He didn't command to send her away. Total misquote. Did Moses anywhere command anyone to write out any certificate or send anyone away? He was not suggesting, prescribing, saying this must be done. If your wife does put too much, salt on the bagels, kick her out. He didn't say that. He didn't say that at all. He said, if you're going to choose to live in total chaos and in total defiance of God's word, well, at least we're going to protect some people here, and we're going to put some legal ordinances in place. But it was not any kind of a condoning, an approval, certainly not a commandment that these divorces take place. And then he says, listen to what Jesus says. He said to them, verse 8, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, and from the beginning it was not so. This whole divorce business is predicated on your sinfulness and the hardness of your heart. For you to bring this up is an indictment on yourselves. We follow the law. That law exists because you would not follow God's initial intention. For you to bring it up, you also have to bring up the fact that we have totally defied God. That's why I'm saying for us to get caught up in loopholes and say, hey, is it all right for me to do this and do this and do this? Do you understand the larger intention here? Do you understand what's at stake here? Do you understand what God is saying about himself before you start looking for technicalities and loopholes? Have we become so litigious? Have we become so nitpicky that we're so intent on finding my way out, my joy, for me to fulfill my purposes and get what I want, that we have set God's ideals to one side? What God has brought together, let no man separate. Have we taken that into account? I understand there are some hard situations. Remember, back to the beginning. There's an exception clause. There are terrible situations. There were times where it seems that there was no other choice. Maybe you did try. Maybe you did try and bring them to Jesus. Maybe you tried and you prayed and they abandoned you and all these other things happened. But at the end of the day, It wasn't about you. It wasn't about our happiness. Because of the hardness of your heart. What Moses is saying is that if you're hell-bent on defying God's intention for marriage, then these are the procedures that are going to protect the women and the children. There was awful things going on. There was guys who would divorce a wife, see that she had married a rich guy. She's got some money. Husband died. Divorce the wife he's got and go bring her back. Oh, baby, you remember when we were together? Just garbage. And God said, that's not going to happen. You can't go back to her. You're not going to be playing. This is not a game. Jesus retorts, from the beginning, it was not so. God wanted a certain way, and you tell me, does God ever change? Does God get more modern with the times? God used to hate divorce. Now he's all right with it. It's not a big deal. God used to hate adultery. Now he says things happen. God is holy. And he remains so. Jesus' authority comes from eternity past and is derived from the sixth day of creation, not from just something he read, not from something he heard as they did. He spoke with authority. Why? Because he heard the account of the sixth day of creation? No, because he was there. John says nothing that was created was ever created without him, and he upholds the whole universe by the word of his power. Everything that is because of Jesus. He's not speaking secondhand. He says, this is how I intended it to be. Don't come to me for technicalities. I say to you, he says in verse 9, whoever divorces his wife, and he states it again, this is how we know this exception is real. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Again, the exception clause. He's not restating, understand, he is not simply restating, this is your out. And let me say it again, this is your out. No. What he's saying is that sex outside of marriage damages what I had in mind. I say to you, with that authority, again, remember, an exception, it's not a commandment. And I'll tell you what else it's not when it's coming from Jesus. When he says, except in the case of adultery, except in the case of sexual immorality, what he's not saying is, because once sexual immorality happens, once somebody cheats on you, I can't fix that one. Then it gets real hard. And you all know that's true because there's some marriages in this house today that have been through that, where the exception clause is sitting right there on the table. And church people would have even clapped for you if you would have walked away. But you ran to Jesus. And you prayed and you held on, and you're here today sitting next to that person. Don't ever think that Jesus was saying, because of that exception clause, you must get divorced. And don't ever think that when he says, when that sin happens in a marriage, I can't fix it. Oh, he can fix it. Sometimes we're so fixed with our eyes on the exit door, we just run. And again, our marriages are to be lived in the light and in the power of God's word to achieve his ideal. You ever ask why? Not why did you marry that person, but why did you marry? And even further, why marriage? I mean, think about it. We're so used to it now. Marriage, yeah, people get married. People get married. But before there was marriage, how did this even occur to God? I'm going to take these two people, and I'm going to make such a deep and abiding community between them that it will be inseparable. It will not come apart. As he reveals something of himself. That our God himself dwells in the richness of community. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but one. Know what this is. Express it to the generations. Let heaven and hell and all know that you are an expression of who I am. Stop looking for technicality. Stop looking to represent something that I'm not. Show the glory of who I am. And it's why he moved the pen of Paul to write what he did to the Ephesians. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church's body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit to in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water by the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Let me stop right there. Do you hear this? Do you hear a holy groom talking about a bride who needs washing? Do you hear a perfect bridegroom talking about his deep love for someone who needs to have spots and wrinkles and such things dealt with? Do you see how he doesn't say, you have spots? I'm done with you. No, he goes to work. He's committed. He works through it. He holds to her. He commits to her. How then do we look for loopholes when we find ourselves in hard times? When just a little bit further in the same chapter, he says, this is a huge mystery. And I'm not even talking about you. I'm talking about Christ and the church. Your marriage is all pointing to that. In that light, it just doesn't make sense to look for the exit door so quickly, does it? And in light of such a glorious and splendid God, it makes it a little harder now to say, it's just impossible. I'm done. I can't. I'm done. It's over. I'm unable. I'm finished. I'm through. You are, huh? And because you are, God's arm has grown short. Well, you can't expect me to live the rest of my life with this guy who doesn't make me happy. No? I'm sorry, where's that? What if that is your portion? What if you live out the rest of this wisp of a vapor that is life, being faithful to God, giving him a daily sacrifice of faithfulness? Oh, I'm not saying don't pray for happiness. I'm not saying don't pray for healing. I'm not saying don't pray for the spiritual growth of your mate. But I'm saying, what if God says, that's yours? Is he not worth it? Is God not worth it? Will tough times come? Will mistakes be made? Yes. But will our reactions in those hard times reflect the devotion that God has shown us? Oh, because the church has been quite unfaithful. God has always been enamored with a people who are given to whoredom. That's not my word. I know it sounds rough. Read the scriptures. And yet, he's in love. So you see how love's not a feeling you fall into and out of? Like a hole? It's a decision based on the empowering, inspiring example of a love that's been shown to you and to me. So in the time of trouble, will our response look like his? In the time of unfaithfulness, will we turn to him before the courts? In the time of questioning, should I go on or should I quit, will we answer the way he did in devotion and in commitment? And in the time when we feel like I'm done and I can't anymore, will we even fathom the possibility that just because I can't doesn't mean that he can't? Will we be so given? I pray that the church would say yes and amen. I pray that our hearts would be so given to live for Christ. And you might be saying, man, this sounds serious. All you single folks, you might be saying, man, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. I was kind of going in with the eject button mentality that I might be able to get out of this thing if things get ugly. You're not alone when marriage gets laid out with the weight that it deserves. You ought to think twice and pray and make sure they're thinking twice and praying. The reaction of his disciples in Matthew 19, that portion we just read, after he's done telling them, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And the response of the disciples, verse 10, the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Yeah, if you don't get it, and if you're looking to get out, and if you're going in with your bags packed, it is better not to marry than to go in and to make a shame and a sham out of what God created and what reflects His faithfulness. Don't even do it. But if you do, and if you are married, devote yourself to His glory, count on His help and His Spirit, and have that married life shine bright in a world where marriages are falling apart, children are being scattered. Help the next generation to have examples, if not in their own home, at least in the church that they come to see marriage can be beautiful. It can glorify God, and God can help two sinners stay together for the glory of His name. Pray with me.